All right, so now we're back to the advantages and disadvantages of each side on the Civil War. So for last class, we focused on the Confederacy, and we highlighted some of their generals, namely Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet. And today we're going to quickly go through advantages and disadvantages of the Union. I'm not going to focus much on their generals, but that might come up in another um, videos. This is pretty short. So this is a review of what we did last class. So let's get to the advantages of the Union. For one thing, they had a larger population. In fact, they had 4 times the amount of free people than the Confederacy had. They also had more industry and made about 90% of all goods that were made at the United States in the time, right? Much more industry in the North than the South. They also had more resources, and I gave you guys some examples here. North produced 17 times more cotton and woolen textiles than the South. So even though we think of the South and cotton, they were still making more in the North. There were still farms in the North, right? There's a reason why New Jersey's nickname was the Garden State. Um, the North made 30 times more leather goods, which is important for harnessing horses, for uniforms, all things like that. The North made 20 times more pig iron, which is good for making, think cannons, think other types of firearms and fortifications. And in general, they made 32 times more firearms. And obviously, I don't need to explain to you why firearms are important in a war. So much, in fact, that the North produced 3,200 firearms to every 100 produced in the South. And I mean, that's not even a game, when you're doing with that. It's too far of a difference. They also had a better banking system, so for when it came to financing the war, and also had more railroad mileage. 70% of all railway lines in the United States were in the Union, and that makes sense because that's where the industry was. So you see the map on the right shows you all the rail lines, and you can see how many more are in the north. And the orange dots also relate to urban populations. So you see the north had many more urban centers, right? Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Chicago, Boston, St. Louis, right? So you think of that as a population of free people who could either work or fight and also create goods. Look at the South's urban centers, and there weren't a lot. You have New Orleans, which was captured, and then some other, smaller ones along the coastal lines. Most people compare the leadership of Abraham Lincoln as superior to that of Jefferson Davis. So therefore, that was an advantage. The Union also had many more ships. They had a better balance between their farming and their industry, and they also had a functioning government. Just ignore that Q there. So of course, the government was having pretty serious issues when states are succeeding, but there was still a government in place. There was still a constitution in place. There was still a president and the 3 branches of government. So the Confederacy had to sort of create that as this was going on. So that gave them a huge advantage that they already had a system to work with. But the Union had disadvantages as well. You see, this photo is from Atlanta. So that was still an urban center in the South. And most of the fighting was in the South, which was unfamiliar to almost all of the Union soldiers. And the people there were in the South were fiercely loyal and adamant on protecting themselves. So they faced hostile people that were in their territory. They weren't familiar with the territory, and the Southern Territory was large. It's not like you were just taking back a little chunk of area that succeeded. It was massive and massive amounts of land and populated areas. They were also against highly motivated soldiers that were often well trained with how to use their guns, and they were under great military leadership, as we discussed about the leadership of people like Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. The Union sort of struggled with their leadership. It was replaced several times. We talked about Winfield Scott and McClellan and all these other people before it finally ended up with Grant, someone that sort of was on the same page with Lincoln. So that was a big hurt for the Union, is that they had to fight against these really motivated soldiers who were under great leadership. Okay, so we'll talk more probably about some Civil War battles and the theaters in the war. And hopefully today you saw some of the things related to Civil War prison camps that often don't get much attention in schools, but um, you know, definitely do deserve some attention. If you have any questions on this, please let me know, and I will see you next class. Um, who knows when that will be with the snow coming up? But if it is snowing, just please stay safe, my wonderful sophomores.